Today we're going to talk a bit more about political decision making. A couple of you asked questions last time about why I'm constantly going back and forth between politics and markets. Well, the answer is that this is a class in political economy, and those are the two ways we really have to choose things. And my difficulty in participating in policy debates is often you see arguments of the following form. Y is a problem. We should do something. X is something. We should do X. That's not very good logic. So if you see markets doing something poorly, people say, the state should do that. Or if you see the state doing something poorly, we say, markets should do that. Doesn't follow. You need to compare each of them as they actually are. There are many problems with using politics. There are many problems with using markets. They're different problems. They're useful for different things. What I hope you will have when you come out of this class is a reasoned skepticism about arguments on either side that just say, well, we should always use whatever. It's not true. Sometimes, noticing that there's a problem, at a minimum, you would like to impose the restriction that whatever you do doesn't make it worse. So, there's a problem, Y, we should do something, X is something, we should do X, is a bad form of argument. Problem that you'll have, and I can warn you this in advance, if you have reasoned skepticism, what people will say is, you must favor Y. Well, that doesn't follow. The problem is you just don't think X will fix Y. Let's look at politics. Why does there have to be a best alternative? Now, we've seen several times, looking at the apples, broccoli, carrots example, there may not be a best alternative in the sense that we're using votes from citizens to decide. But there does have to be a best alternative in the sense that the state can only do one thing. We can only have one speed limit. We have one defense budget. We have one policy on reproductive rights, at least in each state. It is the nature of the state that we're making one choice from many that will apply to all. It's the nature of the state that we're making one choice from many that will apply to all. Now, there's some settings where that's just not very good. If I were to say, what are we going to have for lunch today? What would you say? You'd say, what is this we you're talking about? Why do we decide that? I'm going to go somewhere and have lunch. You're going to go somewhere and have lunch. We'll all choose different things. Why would we want to choose just one thing? The problem with state policy is that it always involves choosing just one thing for everyone. So we have to choose one thing from among many that will then apply to all. There's two problems with using political choice, and we talked about these last time. One is the problem with agenda control. It's not obvious that there exists a single best alternative, and that means that the person who chooses the sequence of votes has powers that can be tantamount to dictatorship. If I get to choose the sequence of votes, I get to pick the outcome. I, by myself, get to pick the outcome. That's not democratic, although it has the trappings of democracy. The drawback is it has the trappings of democracy. You can be duped into thinking, we voted, it must have been democratic. Second problem that we talked about last time also was strategic voting. One way to combat agenda control is to use strategic voting, but that means that people are misrepresenting their preferences. They're voting in a way that doesn't represent their true preferences. That's a subversive act. It may be perfectly justified, but it's a subversive act. It means that if, in effect, they're dissidents to the procedure. The process then loses legitimacy because people say, to get what I want, I have to lie. Whereas we think of voting as a way of discovering truth. Well, it can't be if people, to get what they want, are obliged to lie. People then look for extra-constitutional solutions, including revolution, if they think the system is too illegitimate. Those are problems that are inherent in political choice. If you look across the world, stability is a variable. If by stability you mean the duration of regimes, the duration of political regimes. Some nations last for quite a while, and some change. Now, we talked last week about that quote from Aristotle. How much does a constitution have to change before you would say it's actually a different constitution? Well, if there's a revolution in a completely different form of government, that's not stability. For about half the world, average regime length is only 7 or 8 years. For half the countries in the world, not half the population, but half the countries, average regime length is only 7 or 8 years. They don't have stable institutions. So different nations have different institutions of choice. Those are more or less effective at different times. One of the things that political scientists ask is how do institutions generally, and U.S. institutions in particular, make our political system more or less stable? And is stability a good thing? Last week we saw the movie of The Bridge. To some extent, stability is a good thing, because if it's too unstable, the bridge will fall. But extreme stability becomes rigidity. Extreme stability becomes rigidity, which means that the system and the power structures that it creates are impervious to changes in the desires of the citizens or to injustices in the distribution of wealth and power. One of the things that institutions do is to reify, to capture, to congeal the distribution of wealth and power. If that distribution of wealth and power is unjust, then in effect the institutions are unjust because they're protecting that unjust distribution of wealth and power. Not surprisingly, the people who have wealth and power are big fans of stability. People who see the system as unjust would like to see more change. Problem is that change, without understanding the problem of institutions, can give you that bridge that starts to rock and then fall. What are the implications then of different institutions for justice and for growth? Is there a trade-off between institutions that we see as being just and institutions that foster growth? Regardless of whether you think inequality is just or unjust, does growth cause inequality? Does growth cause inequality? Is a system that's focused on the rapid expansion of a market economy consistent with widely shared economic gains? Well, I want to talk about a version of political choice that's called the spatial model. And this comes directly from the chapter in the Choosing in Groups book that's assigned for today. There are three aspects of the spatial model that are important for our purposes. The first is the way we represent voter preferences. The metaphor is voters like candidates who are closer to them. Voters like candidates who are closer to them, where closer is a measure of agreement. So a candidate is closer to me to the extent that that person's policy positions conform to mine. If there's two candidates who disagree, the one who's relatively closer I prefer. That gives us then a measure of distance. How far away is the candidate from me? I choose the one who is closer. This suggests a metric for understanding political competition. If voters choose based on closeness, we would expect political parties and candidates to choose platforms based on the location where most of the voters are. So candidates select their position based on predicted voter choices. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute, but to foreshadow, the answer usually is the center. The center of the distribution of political preferences that is effectively enfranchised by the institutions of the society are where political power lies. And so candidates and parties try to appeal to the center. One of the things that democracy does is it makes all votes the same. One person, one vote. If I need a majority of the votes to win, I need to be closest to the most voters. And either I choose my policy positions based on that, or I lose the election. And then we have a prediction about outcomes. If we know voter preferences and candidate positions, and we know the voting rule, we can predict who's likely to win. Now, those predictions are imperfect because voters also use characteristics of candidates that are not spatial. Maybe trust, experience, my sense of that person's character. But it's not true that I will always choose someone that I think is honest. Suppose I hear a speech by Adolf Hitler. I'll probably like him better if I think he's lying. If I hear a speech by some white supremacist, I'll probably like him better if I think he's lying. I admit I still won't like him, but I'll like him better if I think he's lying. Suppose I think that he's a white supremacist who is also extremely honest and competent. Well, his honesty and competence would actually cut against him. So even non-spatial characteristics are influenced by their spatial character. It's not true that I always value honesty and competence. If it's someone I really disagree with, I actually hope they're dishonest idiots. Here's a graph from the book that we try to use to represent the form of preferences. So the vertical axis is utility, or the level of satisfaction. How much do I like this person or this alternative? In this case, we're talking about budgets. So we have three people, A, B, and C, and each of them have an ideal point. A wants a budget of 210. He likes a budget of 290 less, and the reason you can tell that is that the level of utility for 290 is less than the level of utility for 210, which maximizes his utility. Person B has relatively weak diffuse preferences, so he has a lower, much flatter utility function. And a utility function just takes budget and maps it into satisfaction. It's a way of summarizing how people evaluate political alternatives. Person C wants a budget of at least this amount, but notice that their utility function is asymmetric. They very much dislike any budget less, but budgets larger than that amount are okay. So this person is basically someone who wants a big expansion in this budget. So maybe it's a farmer and this is an agricultural bill. Person agrees that this is the most that we should spend, but if we spend more than that, it's okay. It'll be really bad if we spend less than that. Or maybe it's someone who is a hawk in terms of military or foreign policy. It would really be bad if we spend less than this amount, but if we spend more, it's okay. So this is a symmetric preference, this is a diffuse preference, and this is an asymmetric preference. Well, I've already given you the algorithm, and we've talked a bit before in the example about how much salt should our little city buy. Remember, political power lies in the center of the distribution of preferences that are effectively enfranchised by the institutions of the society. The center. Well, if we know that this group of three people is trying to decide on a budget, And the example in the book is they're going to have a party. They're going to have a party, and the three of them agree that they will all split equally the amount they spend on the party. So person A just thinks that they can use somebody's iPod connected to a speaker. Person B doesn't care that much but would like to have a little more. Person C wants to have a band. Not a very good band because it's only a little over $1,000. A band for 3 people for $1,000 seems excessive. That's going to be pretty expensive. The three of them disagree. What will they pick? Do you need to be in the room? You do not. You know the answer is the median, right here, about 300. How can that be, you say? How can you predict the future? Well, suppose not. Suppose that any budget larger than that median is proposed. What would happen? C will vote for it, A and B will vote against it. That loses. Suppose it's a budget less than the median. What will happen? A will vote for it, B and C will vote against it. It would lose 2-1. If we ever get to this, to the median preference, it will defeat any other alternative in a pairwise comparison. Why does not this run afoul of the problem we saw last week? Remember, last week I said that the necessary conditions for the existence of a cycle were 3 choices, 3 choosers, and disagreement. Seems like we have that here. There's 3 choices, there's 3 choosers, and there's disagreement. The answer is that preferences here are single-peaked. These preferences are single-peaked, and I haven't explained that yet, but I want you to keep that in mind. This visual, obviously they're single-peaked. Remember what I said last week was the condition, the additional condition besides 3 choices, 3 choosers, and disagreement? It was that a substantial proportion of the population thinks the middle alternative is worst. A substantial proportion thinks the middle alternative is worst. If you have 2 people that like something a little and 1 person who likes it a lot, the 2 win. Remember I said democracy is 2 wolves and a sheep asking what's for lunch. You don't get to weight preferences. That's a problem with democracy. Suppose we had a market. Then A would say, I really care about this, I'll pay you to do what I want. So that's an argument for using markets instead of politics. Politics is really bad at choosing the utility maximizing alternative because it's 1 person, 1 vote. Politics is really bad at choosing the utility maximizing alternative. Now suppose that we were to use these graphs in just the way that you propose, though. I would report that my utility function is up through the roof to get what I want. I would misrepresent. So if we tried to use this system, but people self-report the intensity of their utility, they would lie. And so I'm not saying there's a better way, but it is a problem. There's no reason to expect voting to maximize utility. What it does is maximize the number of people who support it. This alternative, if preferences are single-peaked, this median, will defeat any other alternative. It's called the Condor Say Winner. We talked about the Marquis de Condor Say, and you read about it in the book. The Condor Say Winner is that alternative which defeats all other alternatives in pairwise elections. That alternative which defeats all other alternatives in pairwise elections. Generally, there's no reason to expect that a Condor Say Winner exists. And with apples, broccoli, and carrots, we saw that no Condor Say Winner existed. However, if there's a Condor Say Winner, you probably want your electoral system to select it. Now suppose that C, the person who wanted a band, decided that they wanted to have, I don't know, something horrible, Taylor Swift. All right, so we're going to have Taylor Swift for our party. And yeah, it's going to cost $7 million, but it'll be totally worth it. We'll get to do selfies. It's pretty horrifying. So instead of being here, C's preference is over here. It's not to scale. All right, what would happen? Nothing. Nothing. Politics does not react to changes on its fringes. Early on, we talked about that as being a disadvantage because it's not very good at innovation. But it is very good at identifying the central tendency of what people as a group want. So if we were talking about personal computers here, and this person out here is Steve Jobs saying, you know, personal computers are really great. The median wouldn't believe it. Markets choose at the margin. Politics chooses at the median. Markets choose at the margin. Politics chooses at the median. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes it's bad. Suppose that C, after going through his Taylor Swift phase, says, all right, I'm tired of this. I don't like all these bands that other people like. I want to have just an MP3 of this indie band that I like that no one's ever heard of. And you notice that C always has burns in his mouth because when he eats soup, he has to eat it before it's cool. I needed a drum roll. That was totally a joke. Don't write that down. Don't come up after class saying, that was a joke. He has to eat it before it's cool because he's a hipster. Thank you. So C moves from here over to here. What does that do? Well, that changes the median. Now we're going to pick A's ideal point because C is over here with his little indie rock phase. A is here, B is here. But it requires that someone completely changes their mind. But if the location of the median changes, then politics changes. Does everybody see the difference? A large move in this direction that doesn't change the median doesn't change the outcome. A relatively small move in this direction that changes the median does change the outcome. Political power lies at the center of the distribution of preferences that's effectively enfranchised by the institutions of the society. Now, why would we want to use spatial models? If you read newspaper articles, in fact, if you watched the Democratic debate last night, I'm sure that you heard some descriptions about left and right, that Bernie Sanders is on the far left. Jim Webb from Virginia is relatively centrist. So we have these words that we use, and we all have some kind of shared understanding. Left or right compared to what? Well, the underlying dimension is something political scientists call ideology. Ideology is a kind of summary of your position on many issues. Ideology is a summary of your position on many issues. But that usage of left and right originated after the French Revolution, and it had to do with the physical positions of people in the French General Assembly. So there was, on the left, a big row of seats, a kind of grandstand. And that's where the Jacobins were. And the Jacobins were throwing stuff and yelling, and they wanted change. So we associated the left with change, with radicalism. On the right, in what they called the swamp or the plain, the large flat areas, were the Girondins. And the Girondins were kind of middle-class, bourgeois. They also had control of the government. Now, they were opposed to the king and to the church. They had favored the overthrow of the king and the confiscation of church lands. but they were still relatively conservative in the sense that they wanted to preserve most market institutions, institutions of property, things like that. And the Girondins at first had control of the government. They were in favor of the status quo, of preserving existing institutions. So we tend to think of the right as being either in favor of the status quo or returning to a previous status quo, even if that previous status quo never actually existed. It may be mythological. But the right wants to stop change or reverse change. The left wants radical change. Now, this can make for some oddities. In the former Soviet Union, for example, what is the political right in the former Soviet Union? It's people who would like to restore the Communist Party. The left is people who want to move in the directions of market reforms. So it's not the sort of left-right that we necessarily think about. The left-right ideology that we associate with a country depends on the political culture of time and place. Ideology depends on the political culture of time and place. Still, the left generally refers to those wanting change, and the right generally refers to those who prefer the status quo or a return to earlier policies. So we think of that ideological dimension. Where will the country be if this is the location of the median voter? If you're a candidate on the left, what policy should you propose? Well, if I propose this policy and the rightist candidate proposes this policy, who will win? Whoever is closer to the median voter. The median voter is going to select the candidate who is closer to his or her ideal point. Well, what should the candidate of the left do? It should move closer. But if the leftist candidate gets closer to the center than the candidate of the rightist candidate will move closer. Now, there's a bunch of assumptions that underlie that analysis, that dynamic prediction. The dynamic prediction is you would expect parties and candidates to converge to the position of the median voter. The prediction is parties and candidates will converge to the position of the median voter. We don't actually see that. There's a variety of reasons why, and if you take more advanced political science classes, you'll learn more about that. But the prediction of the basic spatial model is you would expect convergence to the position of the median voter. Why? Well, suppose you care about winning. You can win by moving to the position of the median voter. Suppose you care about policy. I don't care about winning, I care about policy. Well, if you lose, the other side gets to implement their policy. So you still care about winning. Even if someone who cares only about policy has to win, which means that you have to be closer to the median voter than the other side. This is the basic dynamic of politics. The trade-off between having your own policy views and the necessity of winning the election. It means that you often have to compromise. You have to give up on your policy preferences in order to get your candidate in office. What that means is, if both sides do converge, there's no difference between the parties. There's no particular reason for people to vote. This raises the odd possibility that an electorate entirely satisfied with the political process, you would see zero turnout. There's no reason to vote because the candidates are exactly the same. You might expect higher turnout in highly polarized elections. But it's not obvious that highly polarized elections are a good thing. So you can imagine a situation where high turnout is bad, that is really polarized, contentious elections. And you can imagine a situation where low turnout is good. Both of the parties have chosen candidates who want exactly what the median voter wants, and the median voter says, I don't really care. So indifference might be a good thing. Spatial theory is a different approach than the approach we've been taking so far, which I hadn't really named, but it's called the weak ordering approach, and it's described at some length in the book. The weak ordering approach just means I like A better than B and B better than C. Doesn't have to be arrayed along any kind of dimension. I could be indifferent between different ones. But a weak ordering just means I have an order of preferences. Given n alternatives, I can rank them from best to worst. In this case, we have an explicit utility function, which is distance. Anything that's closer, I like better. Voters on the edge can change their position without influencing the outcome. The outcome then is relatively stable under many circumstances. Under some conditions, you would expect the candidates to converge to the center. Under other conditions, the outcome might be polarized or indeterminate. And again, those conditions are beyond our scope here. I just want you to know the basics of the median voter theory. Voters then perceive candidates as platforms or points in that space. And the policy space is the Cartesian product of all the policy positions taken by the candidate. Each issue might be assigned a salience or a weight. In a multidimensional space, I might not have the same weight on all issues. I might care about defense and education, but I might care less about defense than about education. So it's not space strictly speaking. It would be a problem where we would have to weight preferences differently on different dimensions. So there's two kinds of voting that political scientists talk about: committee voting and mass elections. Committee voting and mass elections. In committee voting, there's a relatively small number and we expect everyone to vote. In mass elections, there are many voters, so many that no individual's vote matters very much. This is a problem because it means that I might have a preference between the candidates, but I know that my vote will not determine the outcome. This leads some people to question whether it's even rational to vote in the first place. I happen to think that it is, but perhaps for different reasons. Let me explain why briefly. It is true that in most of the elections in which you, or if you haven't, your parents have participated in, their vote did not determine the outcome. I voted in 2012 and in 2014, and not one of the races that I voted in was decided by a single vote. And that's what's required for my vote to have mattered in the sense of determining the outcome. It has to have been decided by a single vote. And you can say, wait, what if everyone thought that way? And I would say, Jedi you are. Because you think that somehow you voting influences everyone else, because you are God's special snowflake. I have bad news, that's not true. It really is just you. It's not, what if everybody thought that way? It's everybody else thinks the way they think. What are you going to do? Your vote doesn't matter. Your vote doesn't determine the outcome. Many of you are freshmen. Those of you who are not freshmen, how many of you have been to see a basketball game here at Duke? Probably most. Why? You could have just read the score the next day on TV. In particular, some of you may have gone to see Duke play UNC, a battle of the Archangel Gabriel against Satan himself. Now, I'm a UNC fan, so I disagree about who's Satan and who's the Archangel Gabriel, but still, I recognize the metaphor. Only in basketball. I can root for Duke and everything else, but in basketball, I've never made the transition. Why do you go to the game? People stand up, they paint themselves, they sometimes say, speaking as if with one voice, yay. Hooray for our side. Is it because they think that them saying yay will influence the outcome? No, it's because it's the gosh darn right thing to do. I need to be here. These other people are evil. If you'll spend all that time and money to go to see a basketball game as a participant, rather than just sitting back and having hopes about the outcome, I think that also explains people's attachment to political parties. If we had a game that said 5 guys against another 5 guys, you wouldn't care. If we had an election of a bunch of people running against a bunch of other people, I wouldn't even know what the issues were. Parties simplify, explain, and present issues in a way that we develop attachments to. One of the problems the United States has is that many people don't really have an attachment to one of the parties. The fastest growing group is unaffiliated. But parties help solve that problem. They give you a sense not that your vote will affect the outcome, but in effect going to the voting booth and saying, yay, for my side is something that I should do because I identify with this group. So in committee voting, people think their vote matters. They think about the difference. In mass elections, we have to solve that collective action problem of getting people to vote some other way. And even though I may think I should go and vote, it doesn't mean I learned anything about the issues. Doesn't mean that I'm actually qualified or competent to vote, which may mean that sometimes elections may not give us the outcome that we had hoped for. But still, it does help solve the problem of getting people to vote in the first place. So, an overview of the median voter theorem. If preferences are single-peaked, and if political conflict takes place along one dimension, then political power lies at the center of the distribution of preferences, effectively enfranchised by the institutions of the society. So that's that thing that I've said 3 or 4 times pretty fast, actually written out. If preferences are single-peaked and if political conflict takes place along one dimension. Now, that may not happen very often, but it's interesting that we know so much about the political process if it does. If preferences are single-peaked over a unidimensional space, then a median exists. Another way of saying that is that a median exists. If the number of people is odd, the median is a single point. If it's even with no shared ideal points, the median is going to be a closed interval of the line. For even n with shared ideal points, the median might be unique or interval. And here's why. If there's 4 people, where's the median? Well, it's anything in the closed interval B to C. That is, it includes its endpoints. So person C and person B and any point in between cannot be defeated by a majority. How do we know that? Suppose we're here and we vote to change. Well, 2 will vote one way and 2 will the other. That's not a majority, it'll be a tie. So the problem for small groups of using majority rule is you may often get ties. Almost always, decision-making bodies have odd numbers for this reason. So if you look at the previous page, you can see the median is always going to be a single point for odd n. So you may have wondered, why is it that the Supreme Court of the United States has 9 members, not 8 or 10? It's because we can pick a single outcome. So generally, we're going to have an odd number. Now, for larger groups, the North Carolina General Assembly, for example, has 120 members. But for larger groups, it's less likely to matter. So here are 5 ideal points. B and E are both stacked up here. Obviously, that's going to be the median. Here's 4 ideal points. We have A, B, D, and E. I took C out. So even with an even number, there can be a unique median if some of the ideal points are shared. And again, this is all directly from the book, literally verbatim from the book. Let's look at an example for the Affordable Care Act that's often called Obamacare. Let's simplify to 3 choices, 3 groups of choosers and preference profiles, and disagreement. So now we've gone back to the previous way we were thinking about it. What are you not seeing in this example? Single-peaked. I didn't say single-peaked. So I want to demonstrate again how important single-peakedness is. Let's suppose we have 3 groups, the left that want a strong public option, the right that want to maintain the status quo on private health care, and a center alternative that want pretty much what was actually the Obamacare legislation. No public option, but mandatory participation, payment of fees. At the time, it was of questionable constitutionality. It turns out that because it was a tax, it was okay. But at the time, it wasn't clear how that was going to work out. Well, we have 3 groups, the reformers that want, going back here, remember the left, the strong public option is P, Obamacare is O, and the status quo is S. So the strong reformers want either to go all the way to a public option, something like single payer. Second best is the status quo. The worst thing we can do is take a half measure and make the insurance companies more powerful by retaining a private system like Obamacare. The incrementalists said even a small move in direction of socialized health care is better. Second best would be the pure public option. The worst thing we could do is stay at the status quo. The conservatives just want less government intervention, so the status quo is best. Obamacare is second best. The worst is to move to a public option. Notice that the reformers have a non-single peak preference. The reformers have a non-single peak preference because they think the middle alternative is worst. Well, from that, you can recognize that what's going to happen is, and we talk about this example more in the book, the outcome is going to depend on the sequence of votes. And in the book, I'm not going to go through the mechanics of it, but in the book we talk about the problem that Obamacare's victory probably was a result of a miscalculation on the part of the reformers. Because actually it was their least preferred alternative, and it's the one we ended up with. So it's a problem of political strategy. But the picture that I want you to have is, this is what non-single peak preferences look like. This one right here, this line. Somebody thinks the middle alternative is worst. As long as you don't have that, the median voter theorem works. As long as you don't have that, the median voter theorem works. So we designate something x median as the median position for the society, then the number of votes for x median has to be greater than or equal to the number of votes for any other alternative z. A median position, if it exists, is a Condor Say Winner, which means it can never lose in a majority vote. It might tie against another median if the median is an interval. Let me skip a few of these which are described in the book, and you're not responsible for the more technical parts of 5. And let me say a little bit about preferences in 2 dimensions. Have you ever gone hiking and looked at a topographical map? Topographic maps have lines on them, and those lines are areas of equal elevation, equal altitude. So suppose you wanted to climb this mountain, and you can tell it's a mountain because it says Green Mountain, and this is a peak. It's about 1,000 meters. Suppose you wanted to climb this mountain. What route would you take? Well, you might take what looks like the shortest route, which looks like it's right here. So you cross a line, you cross a line, these shaded areas are lines of equal elevation. What do we call, in terms of hiking, an area where these lines are really close together? Steep. It means that you're going up very quickly. The distance between the lines is how many horizontal units you get for each vertical unit. So on a topographic map, if they're very close together, that's a steep increase. So suppose that we were to represent a utility function like a topographic map, where the axis that comes out towards us is the level of utility. So I'm taking that one-dimensional graph I had before and making it a three-dimensional graph now. There's two dimensions that represent policy, but it's like utility is coming out towards us. Well, then what you would get is a topographic map. Let's suppose we have issue 1 and issue 2. We have person 1, person 2, and Alice. I could have called them 3, but it's much more fun to call the person Alice. See? Already I can see it in your faces. Gosh, that is fun. I hadn't expected that, but that's right. Because he could have just said 3. We have 2 issues, issue 1 and issue 2, and 3 voters. What do we expect that they will do? Well, one thing we would like to know is, does the problem, the solution that we had before, still work? What was the solution we had before? You have a group of people in single peak preferences. We think the median will win. What about the median now? Well, can there be a median in 2 dimensions? Sort of, because we can look at the median in each dimension individually. How would that work? Well, Alice is the median on issue 2. Person 2 is the median on issue 1. That point then is the vector of medians, the set of medians issue by issue. That seems like a plausible first conjecture for what we would expect this group of people to do in a multidimensional space. Now here's the part that's like a topographic map. What do we call the geometric figure that has the property that all the elements of the figure are equidistant from a point? Circle. It's called a circle. So let's ask, where are the points that 2 likes as well as that vector of medians? And it's a circle. It's all the points that are exactly as far from 2's ideal point as the median is. So 2 is indifferent between this point and this point and this point, and importantly this point, which is the set of medians. What would we call the points that are inside this circle? Well, we know 2 likes them better because they are closer to 2 than this point. So not just points on the line between it, but a point over here. If it's inside the circle, 2 must like it better than this point. Anything outside this, 2 likes less well. We call the points on this circle an indifference curve. The points on the circle are an indifference curve. It's like the indifference curves you may have seen in economics, but it has different properties because now we're looking at politics. All right, what about for Alice? What about for person 1? We do the same thing. We draw the indifference curve, the circle, that goes through the vector of medians. We recognize that any point inside the indifference curve is preferred by that person to the median. Anything outside is less preferred. I have goosebumps. This is so exciting. Can we model majority rule here? Yes! Yes, we can. What is majority rule? Majority rule means, is there at least a majority that likes something better than the status quo? Well, there's 3 people. It takes at least 2. How would we tell what points the people like better than the status quo? It's points that are inside the indifference curve. What would a majority look like on this graph? It would be the intersection of the sets that two or more people prefer. That's so beautiful. There are little squiggles, I understand, but metaphorically, it's so beautiful. All of those points are majority preferred to the vector of medians. Remember, where I got this point is that it's the median on this direction and it's the median on this direction. Does it work? Does the median voter theorem extend to multiple dimensions? And it doesn't straight up, because even if there is a median issue by issue, when we look at the question, is there an overlap between the preferred two set of 2 with respect to this and the preferred two set of Alice, for example, with respect to this, these squiggles say that there's at least one point, and in this case many. Some people call these flowers, some people call them propellers. I'm agnostic myself. But they always have that look of radiating out from the center like flower petals or parts of a propeller. Well, this suggests an understanding of something that's an equilibrium or a Condor Say Winner in multiple spaces. The intersection of these sets, the thing that's inside is called the preferred two set. It's the set of points I like better. The intersection of all those sets would have to be empty. The intersection would have to be empty. Notice that it's non-empty. There's an overlap, like a Venn diagram, between the set of points that 2 likes better and the set of points Alice likes better. There's an overlap between the points that 2 likes better and that 1 likes better. There has to be 0 overlap for something to be an equilibrium. Well, let's suppose that 1 and Alice get together and say, you know, we can compromise and make both of ourselves better off. Let's do that. Let's propose this point. Will it beat the status quo? Yes, because Alice and 1 will both vote for it. Alice and 1 both prefer this point to this point. Does everybody see why? It's inside the indifference curve that goes through the previous point. All right, how about that point? Is that point an equilibrium? Well, let's move to that and let's do the same visually exciting thing. And we'll draw the indifference curves that pass through it. The intersection is still non-empty. If you look at the intersection of the preferred two sets of a majority of the voters, it's still non-empty. Now, that's a bunch of language that says the same thing as these people would vote for any of these points compared to this. If they have free proposal power, it means this cannot be an equilibrium. So intuitively, the way for you to think of this is in multiple dimensions. When would we expect there to be an equilibrium? Remember, in one dimension, there's going to be an equilibrium if preferences are single-peaked. These preferences are single-peaked. This is the person's ideal point. That's the peak. We can have indifference curves that are circles, like a topographic map. The answer is, and I've just given you a sketch of the proof why, in multiple dimensions, in general, even if preferences are single-peaked, there does not exist an equilibrium of majority rule voting. In general, there does not exist an equilibrium of majority rule voting. Now, I give a more extensive example here, but all it would take is these points to overlap. All you would ever need with respect to a particular point is that these points overlap. I define here the Pareto set. We'll not need to know that. Let me skip just to the end. Generally, if you look at a median point. The median in issue by issue. The win set, and the win set is the intersection between the preferred two sets of a majority, is non-empty. That's actually the proof that there's no equilibrium. The win set is, and again we talk about this in the book at more length. The win set is the set of points that would defeat an alternative in a majority rule race. The win set is almost always non-empty for every point. That means that in multidimensional space with sincere voting, the sequence of accepted proposals can go anywhere. And in fact, majority rule could even lead to an outcome that everyone agrees is bad. Now, we talked last time about the reason why this is not really a problem. And that is that political institutions are designed to prevent this from happening. In the United States, we use Duverger's law, which gives us two parties. You can't have cycles if there's only two parties. So we solve this problem with institutions. This is a hypothetical problem with democracy. We don't actually have a democracy, we have a constitutional republic that solves this problem with rules. So I'm not saying that actual nations have this problem. However, this problem is the reason that actual nations have the institutions that they have, and not some others. I'll see you on Monday.